dawn on August 21st, 1968, 1,000 Soviet tanks swept into the center of Prague to crush the liberal reforms that had promised hope, freedom, and a new style of government to the people of Czechoslovakia. The trouble between the USSR and its satellite country had been brewing for several months. Alexander Dubček, the new Czech leader, was attempting to distance his country from the hardline Stalinist policies of the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries. He began to relax controls on the press and even initiated democratic reforms. Moscow and the rest of the communist bloc were vehemently opposed to any liberal reforms and tried every possible means to force the Czechs back into line. After months of political maneuvering and threats, Russian troops began massing on the border. Moscow demanded one last meeting.
Would the Russians accept the Czech break from the Kremlin line? They talked and talked. Behind locked doors, the reformist Czechs struggled to convince the Kremlin hierarchy of their loyalty, despite their wish for freedom. After 4 days, it was over. The Russians emerged, followed by the Czechs. Party chief Alexander Dubček and his colleagues were in good spirits. The nation saw hope in their smiles.
But the people's hope for freedom would not be fulfilled. On the morning of August 21st, threats became reality as Soviet tanks and troops descended upon Czechoslovakia.
The citizens of Prague knew the full meaning of occupation by force. The Russians, while supposedly their allies, were not wanted. The fighting spirit of many Czechs was aroused. They retaliated against overwhelming power. But it showed the free world, and Russia too, that their desire to shape their own destiny was stronger even than the heaviest tank or the biggest gun. The Czechs didn't take their bondage lightly. They fought, they disobeyed curfew regulations, they held strikes, and more passively, they did their damnedest not to cooperate with those who had come from outside to regulate their way of life. In the midst of their troubles was the added concern for their leaders, Dubček, Svoboda, and others who had disappeared. However, it was learned they were in Moscow, having talks with the Kremlin bosses. They talked, and the world wondered.
Eventually, Dubček saw the futility of fighting a superior military power and was forced to yield to the Soviets. Although protest and resistance continued throughout the country, it would be another 20 years before the Czechs would be able to throw off the yoke of communist domination and fulfill the promise of that Prague spring morning of August 21st, 1968. July 20th, 1969 was one of the most important dates in world history.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
600 million people watched on live television as Americans landed on the moon and took a giant leap for mankind.
More forward, drift into the right level.
The event fulfilled a promise made 8 years earlier by President John F. Kennedy when he set forth America's commitment to the space program.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
A major step towards that goal had occurred on Christmas Eve, 1968, when the first men orbited the moon.
This is the moon, as no man had ever seen it before. A rugged place of craters, mountains, and vast featureless plains. 70 miles above this uninviting, yet so sought-after world, astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders orbited in Apollo 8, looking coolly down on a scene they factually described as like plaster of Paris.
7 days later, and 500,000 miles into the unknown and back, 3 heroic astronauts returned safely to Earth. On May 18th, Apollo 10, manned by 3 brave explorers, Stafford, Young, and Cernan, was launched. Their mission, to prepare the way for man to set foot on the moon, to knock on the door of our neighbor, but not to enter.
In Apollo 10, nicknamed Charlie Brown by the 3 astronauts, they swooped low over the lunar surface. Then, the boldest experiment of all, as the lunar module, affectionately known as Snoopy, flew to within 9 miles of that rugged planet for man's closest look at one of the keys to the mystery of the universe.
Over 1 million spectators, including press and celebrities, gathered at Cape Kennedy to witness the launch of Apollo 11 and the beginning of man's greatest adventure.
The men setting out on this fantastic journey are called Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Aldrin. They are names which will have their places amongst those of Earth's greatest explorers. The difference is, the moon is their uncharted continent. The time had almost come. Neil Armstrong, 38, married with 2 sons, was, God willing, to be the first man on the moon. Mike Collins, 38, married with 2 daughters and a son, would stay in orbit. Buzz Aldrin, 39, married with 2 sons and a daughter, was to be second man on the moon. The countdown had reached its 0 climax.
Choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
As the astronauts flew their way into history, new technology enabled the world to watch live as it happened. Video signals were sent over 250,000 miles through space back to Earth.
30 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 6, down a half. 30 seconds forward. Straight shadow. 30 seconds forward.
These indeed were tense and dramatic moments as the lunar module came into land, avoiding a deep crater and swooping down towards a safer landing site. The film camera was pointing out of the LEM's right-hand window, and with only a few feet to go, lunar dust was clearly seen spraying up, disturbed by the rocket thrust.
Both autos, Eastern Engine Command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
This was the moment of touchdown.
I'm at the foot of the ladder. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This is the century of discovery, and surely this is the story of the century. In a place known as the Sea of Tranquility had begun the quest for the stars.